me on my screen I'm looking at. Not used to that, but at any rate. Yeah, and others just pop on if they get on, and that's fine.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Good morning, gang. Those who haven't met me, I'm Ed Hansen. I'm your broker. I would say really quick, I'm in my 40th year. I've been running offices, managing offices for 39 of my 40 years. I'm an addict when it comes to purchase agreements. After all, this is the holy grail. You know, for you to have any success at all, you're going to have to get to a closing, which means you're going to have an agreement in place. So this is it. It doesn't matter if you represent buyers or sellers, you really need to know this. So I have a lot to cover. You know, I really could go on for a day on all the different topics. So I'm going to move right along. As we are on a topic, don't hesitate just to blurt out a question. If you have any question, let's try to, not jump 3 pages ahead. Let's just follow, me as I go. I think you'll get more out of it that way. And that will be the plan, if that sounds okay. Now, give me an idea here. I see there's Mike, Lance, Val. How many of you are new?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have one new, and it doesn't really matter. I normally get agents that have been at this and have been through this class 5 times, so it's not a problem. But
Actually, Ed,
do you?
I haven't even taken the real estate class yet, so I'm really new.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm new as well. So yeah.
I'm seeing 6 people that are either brand new or almost to their licensing class, and the rest appear to be new within a year.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Again, don't hesitate to holler out if you have a question as we go. Is it safe for me to say that all of you have the packet that Chanel sent out?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, it's be easier for you if you reference this as we go. And you'll notice on the very first page, there's a copy of a listing card. It may seem weird that this is where I start, but this is kind of an important thing. And there's so much more to just purchase agreements, but hopefully you'll see how everything ties in. Whenever you get to a point where you think you're going to be needing to list a house, or if you think you have a buyer that's going to want to write an offer on a house, at that point, you have to start your due diligence. You need to find out what you can about the house. And the easiest way to do that is to pull up the old listing card. This example that I'm using is an actual listing that I just sold in the past week. Yeah, so it's pretty fresh, but you might find it interesting. So I pulled up the listing card, and you'll see on this listing card, I have like little check marks all over the place. Those check marks means that I went into another source to confirm what I see on this listing card. The scariest part of all that I can tell you is on this listing sheet, there's really only one thing on it that you can rely on completely. And that's right near the bottom when it talks about, well, if you look a few lines up from the bottom, it has an SA with 0%, a BA with 3%. You guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, that references what the listing broker is willing to cooperate by paying a SA is a seller's agent, sub-agent, BA is a buyer's agent, or a transaction coordinator. So it's really important if you're writing an offer representing a buyer that you see, okay, they're going to pay a buyer's agent 3%. Now, everything else on this is just reference information. To make my point, this listing card could say the seller moved out of the property, but just had brand new stainless steel appliances installed, washer, dryer, stove, refrigerator, dishwasher, for the convenience and benefit of the buyer. But the point is, just because it says it on this information sheet doesn't mean the buyer gets it if they write an offer. Everything that the buyer wants has to be written into a purchase agreement. So just realize that this is just an information sheet and you need to verify everything. So if you start looking at all the different check marks, at the top, I checked because I verified that it was indeed in the city of Grand Rapids. I checked how much acres there was, what's the tax ID number, all the way down. It just means I checked it. The way you check this stuff, and you should play with this sometime, just remember, just Google BS and A. BS, the symbol, and A. And it's a website where you put what municipality, what address, or what owner's name, and it gives you the municipality record. So that's how you can check all this stuff. You'll find it to be super helpful. It also helps because it will tell you what the last deed transfer was for how much money, all those good things. Okay, so that's the reason why you check that all out. If I'm going to write an offer, I better make sure I know this stuff. Okay, or if I was going to list this house, I want to make sure the information I'm using is accurate. All right. Okay. Every now and then, give me a yeah or an okay, so I know what's up. I hate Zooms, but it accomplishes our goal, I guess. Okay, page 1 of the purchase agreement. The very top, obviously, is the date. And the significance of the date and the time is simply to put some cohesiveness to this purchase agreement. It ties this the 6-page document together as one. So you don't, I've actually seen offers where somebody writes the date, puts the time noon, but then the second page, it would say 12:05. The next page would say 12:10. Now you just keep one time that ties all these pages together. On the far right, you put in the multiple listings number if you know it. If there isn't one, put a line through it or just put none. Selling office, listing office should be self-explanatory. The selling office, this was me in this case. I had the buyer. So then you have to put our Keller Williams broker license number in there. And then I put my phone number. And then for the listing office, you just list it with the agent's phone number. So far, so good. That part's not too hard. Paragraph 1 talks about effective date. This is really important, and it really helps clarify questions that you'll have through different paragraphs. The effective date, talks about it becomes effective at midnight on the date it's signed. So if we signed an offer today, and what's the date today? The 8th. The effective date tomorrow at midnight would count day 1. So if we talk about having a 10-day inspection period or possession so many days after the closing, day 1 starts at midnight on the effective date, which is at midnight the date it was signed. Everybody got that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So if they are accepting offers on a certain day and time, or they're going to be entertaining the offers and reading them at a certain time, would you put that date then? Or that time?
No.
No,
no.
just the time
No,
you're.
no.
Okay.
This is referencing the time that you're writing an offer
Okay.
to your buyer. So we'll get to that when it talks about possession and all those things, because there's a lot of different things that will refer to the effective date. The inspections, how many days after possession. If they were to say we're going to present offers 3 days after the effective date, all that is important, but it all starts it would be at midnight tonight, because that's what I wrote it. The other part that's interesting when we talk about a date, it's not as if all of us wrote an offer on this property and I wrote mine at noon and you wrote yours at 1 o'clock and somebody else wrote theirs at 2 o'clock. That doesn't matter, because offers do not have to be presented and addressed in the order they were received or in the order they were written. So that doesn't really matter. The time and date is simply to tie this purchase agreement together and reference the agreement. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Okay, paragraph 2, agency disclosure. Now, for some of the new people, I got to be careful because this is I could go on for a long time, but agency disclosure is super important. It's elementary 101 of real estate. You will find that there's a form called the agency relationships, and it's just a form that says, agents, before you start getting pertinent information from a potential client, you need to disclose that agents can represent different people. And you don't want a buyer to be under the impression that you're going to represent them if you're not, because they could disclose information to you. I'm going to assume that at the point that you're writing an offer, you've already gone through all the agency relationships. And in fact, the buyer has agreed that they want you to represent them. So I would say 99% of every purchase agreement that you'll write, you're going to write it representing the buyer. So in this case, yeah, I check the box, I'm representing the buyer. Put my name, my email address, and you have to put your specific real estate license down. Now, are any of you on a team? If you were, let's just say you were on the Ed Hansen team and you were writing an offer. You'd be the primary agent more than likely. You'd put your name there. But if you were on my team, I might require you to put me down as an alternate agent. But for the most part, if you're just, a one-man show, you just do it like I did, okay? Paragraph 3, seller's disclosure statement. Now, this is a 2-page form that whenever you get to the point where you're going to write an offer, you better have that disclosure statement up front so that your buyer can actually see it. But it's just a form that the seller fills out. It asks about the age of some mechanicals, any, was ever. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody said something to me. Nope. Okay. So you get the copy of that disclosure statement and you get it to your buyers so they can review it and they can sign it. If they had signed it, then you check the first box like I did, which just says the buyers received the disclosure statement dated, whatever the date was. Because if you don't have it, then then it opens up the contract for a longer period. And then it's like, whenever it finally comes around where you get the disclosure and get it signed, then, the buyer has 72 hours to accept it. And also there could be information on it that's really important to know before you write an offer. So always make sure you get that ahead of time. Okay?
Hey, Ed, I've got a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Back to section 2. Is dual representation legal in Michigan?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. Every one of these paragraphs I could spend a lot of time on. Let's just take a second there. The first box, agent, sub-agent of the seller, writing a purchase agreement form, it's really easy to see it. If you are the listing agent and you are also going to write an offer, then you would check that box because obviously you represent the seller. Or if you're purely handling a buyer, then you check the box like I did. The only time you can be a dual agent, and this is like, for some reason, this gets confusing for agents, new and old, but there's only one time that you can be a dual agent. The first prerequisite is that you must have the listing, because if you have a listing, you're contracted to represent the seller. A dual agent means obviously that you're in a position where you're supposed to be representing both parties. So first, you have to have a listing. Second, you have to have a buyer that you've had under contract where you've committed to work with them to help them find a house. So let's say you're working with a buyer looking for a house in Northview for $200,000 for months. And all of a sudden tomorrow you list that house and you go, holy cow, this could be good for my buyer. You tell them about it, you show it to them and they want to buy it. Now you're really in a predicament because you listed the house, you're obligated to the seller. The buyer that you're bringing and writing an offer with, you've already committed to him to be a buyer's agent. So that's when you become a dual agent. I hate dual agency. It's legal. There are times that you might have to do it. It's really almost rare. And not to complicate it, but this is what I do. Because usually a listing agent has a unique opportunity because number one, they have the potential to get signs from the yard sign or calls from the yard sign, internet. They might get some, hey, I want to see it. They show it and they can sell them the house. In those cases, you don't typically sign them up as a buyer agent because you already represent the seller in that case. So what I do is I say, obviously, I represent the seller. The good news is the seller's authorized me to tell you whatever it is you want to know. I'm going to treat you fair. I'm going to let you know what's typically negotiated. And people are typically very good with that and fine. So when I do that, I check the first box on your agency, and I'm going to be an agent of the seller because I am the agent of the seller. Okay. So that's the dual agent thing. So it's, and you can only do that with the informed written consent of both. And the part that's so hard is that it's so hard to sell yourself on being their agent and all the good things you're going to do. Then all of a sudden back up and say, well, I really can't represent you. I have to try to play more of a neutral field. And your clients go, what? What the hell did I hire you for? So it's tough. There are some agents that when put in that position will say, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to find another agent and refer that buyer to somebody else and let them represent them. So you'll get a lot more training with all that, but it's kind of interesting actually.
Thank you.
And on number 3, the last box, there's another sheet that it's an exemption, all the different exemptions for seller's disclosures. And for the most part, you want the seller to disclose what they can. For example, a seller could say, I've never lived in the property. They bought it 20 years ago. They've rented it out for 20 years, never lived there. So they go, we've never occupied it. So they don't disclose anything. Well, and most agents go, oh, okay. But for me, I'm going, well, I don't really care if you live there or not. We want a disclosure. Darn well if you've had problems with the house. If there's been water in the basement or how old the furnace is or how old the roof is. So if you don't see the answers you want in a disclosure statement, in your offer, write that you want more detail. A perfect example is, and I'll tell you what, here's some life advice for you when it comes to this business. The second something makes you slow down and just go, what? The odds are there's a reason for that. So don't just blow through it. When the disclosure says, yeah, we had water in the basement, but we professionally fixed it. We haven't had a problem since. Okay, now think about it. What does that mean? To me, it means not a whole lot. I mean, did that happen yesterday? Did that happen 10 years ago? What did they do to fix it? Where was the leak? So if you don't get as much detail as you want, ask for it. Okay. Number 4 is an automatic built-in thing about lead-based paint. And basically, every property, you have to have a disclosure about lead paint. And if a home was built in 1978 or newer, then the seller just has to state that it's newer and they don't have to disclose anything more about lead paint. But if it was built in 78 or older, then there's more of the disclosure they have to fill out and disclose. And the problem with lead-based paint is that every house built before 78 had lead paint. So how do you fix it? You can remove it, which is like crazy expensive. And just think of all the work of removing all the paint in a property, or you encapsulate it. And that's what's been done by 99% of all the houses. They've just since been repainted. But that's lead-based paint. Number 5, property description. You need to go slow and make sure you do this right. Now, in this case, if you look at my listing card, I confirmed the properties in the city of Grand Rapids, County of Kent. And while you're looking at that, you also need to make sure that you know what school district it is, because it's, I have seen it many times where somebody will say, yeah, it's Rockford Schools, but then you get right down to it and you go, oh shoot, it's actually in Comstock Park Schools. That's a big deal for some people. So you need to make sure those things are accurate. So on the legal, we know it's in the city of Grand Rapids. The part where people screw up is the box that says township. And I'm going to take Rockford, for example. People will make a reference and say, yep, I live in Rockford. Well, Rockford is a huge area, and it contains areas that are in the city of Rockford. And it also contains about 4 or 5 different townships that are all in the Rockford district. You really need to know, is this property located in one of the townships or in the city of Rockford. And one of the biggest reasons why is that property taxes, on all the townships that surround the city of Rockford, their tax base is going to be in that neighborhood of like $32 a thousand. Those in the city of Rockford, it's more like $47 a thousand. So it's a huge difference, much higher taxes if you're in the city of Rockford, which is the same for the city of East Grand Rapids, the city of Wyoming. It's super expensive. So you need to know that. So I checked to make sure it was in the city of Grand Rapids. There's the address. And here was the legal description. Lot 30, Maple Vale, plat number 1. Pretty simple, easy. The parcel number, I double checked it on county records. So now I have a good description of what property it is that we're making an offer on. Okay. Sorry, I was just looking, I saw there was somebody, want to make sure you didn't have a question in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, it's
yeah.
Heather. Okay, so what you're saying is don't trust what the selling agent has put on there. Double check everything for yourself, correct?
100%, yes.
Because if it's incorrect, then what happens?
Put it this way. Is a buy, the biggest fear I have in our business is for buyer agents, because almost always information used in part has been collected from a previous listing. And the buyer's agent has committed their fiduciary to the buyer to look out for their best interest. A buyer expects us to make sure we know all these things. So yeah, that's why on that listing card where I went through and I checked those things, it's important. You got to make sure that it's right.
Okay.
And it seems crazy because even today, I'll get a call from an agent that will say they closed the deal and the buyer moves in and they go, hey, the appliances are gone. And I'll say, well, did you negotiate for them in the purchase agreement? And they'll go, well, no, I didn't, because it said it on the comments on the listing card. And then I sarcastically have to say, now, is that listing card an agreement between a buyer and a seller? And everybody can see that clearly, that no, it's just a statement from the seller. So the only thing that is an agreement between a buyer and a seller is the purchase agreement. So anything that you want's got to be on the purchase agreement. Okay. Okay. The next paragraph, the dark printed part says the following paragraph applies only if the premises include unplatted land. Now, this has to do with the ability to split the property. You should always assume that any platted property that has it's just a lot probably can't be split. But the second you start getting into acreage, then it causes possibilities or questions or even dangers or fears of what that property, what you might be able to do with it. So a good question and think about it. Let's just say that a property is on 10 acres. And if you guys don't know this yet, almost in all municipalities, you can split land into 2 or 3 acre parcels without too much trouble. It just has to meet certain road frontage requirements. But as soon as you get anything more than 2 acres, I typically ask the buyer and say, are you good with not being able to split this land? And they'll say, yeah, I want the land for the privacy. I don't want to split it. Then you're fine. But the second you have a piece, let's say it's a 10-acre piece, and the buyer's thinking, yeah, I want to buy this, and then I'm going to split off this half of it because I really don't need it. It doesn't affect my property, and I should be able to make some good money with that. Well, then you need to make sure that you're looking at this paragraph and going, well, if the buyer is buying it under the impression that they'll be able to split it, then you better make sure it can be split. And so in that case, you would say, yeah, we want to make sure it can be split at least one time. And then you're forcing the seller to go and start the process so you can find out that it can be split. The other part of this paragraph too is that you can always fall back on is farther in this agreement, you'll see that there's typically a 10-day inspection and investigation period. and it's a period where the buyer can hire inspectors and check out whatever they want, that is also a good time to have them go. If they need to, like if they want to figure out that, yeah, they want to put a pole barn up in the back, and they're going to ask you, well, can I do it? You need to get into a habit of not trying to know all. You would say, boy, I see others in that area that have it. It should not be a problem, but we definitely need to check with the township. And you should make them do some of that due diligence, because even though you check, and if their plan was to do it in a couple of years from now, township rules can change. So that's something that we'll get into more too, and there'll be other little training classes on how to split land and stuff like that. Number 6, see, we're pushing a half hour and we're not even done with page 1. Now it goes faster as we keep going. Paragraph 6 is just the offer price. And it's kind of interesting. In this case, you can see that I wrote 249,900, and then I spell it out. When you fill this out online and you put in the numeric number, it defaults and automatically spells out the written word for you. But oftentimes there are mistakes. So you can see, I think, and pretty easily recognizable, 249,900. But it's really easy when you're spelling out all those words to go 249,000 and forget the other 900. And when you have a discrepancy between the two, the sad part is that the law will tell you that the written spelled out version supersedes. But the problem is everybody can visually see the numeric number and recognize it more clearly. So it's just a problem. So make sure it's right. Okay. Okay. Number 7, seller concessions. A concession can be absolutely anything. And while I'm on it, when you're making an offer, you guys can agree to absolutely anything you want as long as the buyer and seller agree to it. So when you have a concession, the most common ones are where a buyer will say, I have enough for my down payment, but I need some help covering the cost of the expenses it's going to take to get my mortgage. So it's somewhat used to be common where a buyer would say, all right, seller, I'll give you this price, but I want you to pay $5,000 towards my expenses to get my mortgage. So that's where you would write it. That's a concession. Or you might know in advance that you want the seller to, install a new roof by a licensed contractor. Well, if you know that up front, write it in there. Okay? Okay. Number 8, several things here. For you guys on that second paragraph in number 8, put a little star there, because that basically says if the property's value stated in an appraisal, if it's less than the purchase price, you got a problem. But it tells you exactly what you need to do to correct it. And if the buyer, and if it doesn't appraise, the buyer normally has an out thing, say, well, forget it, I'm not buying the house. The buyer and seller can renegotiate. Maybe the seller will say, okay, well, I'll come down if you come up. But the key thing is, it talks about that if you don't come to anything in writing, then it just means that that you'll proceed to the closing as is. So let's say your appraisal is $10,000 short. If you don't terminate the deal or renegotiate with the seller within 3 days, as it states in that paragraph, if you don't do anything, then you've just agreed to accept it as is, which means the buyer has to come up with that $10,000 in cash. And that will be a problem if they don't have it. So just make sure that you're always thinking about that if you have that issue, deal with it. If it's a matter of you want to try to work with the appraiser to try to give him additional comps to change it, the odds are you're going to need more time. So within that 3 days, be smart enough to say, hey, here's an addendum. We want to extend this paragraph out for 5 days while we try to correct the low appraisal, something like that. Okay, the first box, cash. This is always interesting. When you have a cash buyer, the first thing you better have is proof that your buyer has cash. So right up front, you should tell your buyer, we're going to need a bank statement. Either get me a statement that shows if you're buying a house for, in this case, let's say 250,000, and if it were cash, get me a statement from your bank shows your name that you have at least 250,000. Your buyers will say, let's say that they have a couple $1 million. They may not want to show the seller they have that much money. And if they don't want to show all they have, then have them get a statement from the bank that says Joe Blow buyer has an excess of 250,000 available to purchase the house. You need some type of proof. Cash means liquid available. Cash does not mean I have to go sell my house, and once I sell my house, then I have cash. It doesn't mean that I have 25 gold bricks in my house and I have to go sell these gold bricks, then I'll have cash. In those cases, those are all contingencies. So if that were the actual case, it would be, yeah, this cash offer is contingent on the buyer selling their gold to come up with the money. Follow me? Just be clear that cash is cash, real cash. The second paragraph talks about a new mortgage, and this is always a contingency in a purchase. So their offer is always going to be contingent on the buyer's ability to get financing. Now, in the first box, I wrote in conventional, and typically there's only really there's FHA, there's conventional, and there's a couple others. It might be VA, which is a veteran loan, but whatever type they're going for, you indicate there. Then you indicate what type of a loan. Are they going to get a 30-year loan or a 15-year loan? And then, so then as you think about this, is it better for your buyer to do and again, I'm talking about as far as the strength of getting your offer accepted with a seller, is it stronger to show that your buyer is going to get a 30-year loan or a 15-year loan? What would you guess?
15.
And you would think 15 but it implies the buyer is stronger because they can make a higher payment. But I might say, well, that also requires a higher income and a stronger buyer to be able to do it. So it doesn't really matter if it's going to be 15 year or 30. It's going to matter to make sure that the buyer is qualified. That's really the key thing. The next little line there where I put, they're going to get a mortgage amount of 80%. Hopefully you can all see when somebody says they're getting an 80% loan, that means they're putting 20% down. Okay. A 20% down payment's a pretty good thing. Most people are really striving to make sure that their buyers can have 20% down. So in the same vein and discussion that we had when we talked about cash, when, like in this case here, my buyer is saying that they're going to get an 80% loan, which means they have 20% down. You got to make sure they have it. You know, a lot of times people will say, okay, I'm going to put 20% down, but I'm getting the 20% down from my dad. Well, if you don't have that 20% down from dad, then your offer is really contingent on getting it. And you need to push to make sure you know that your buyer is financially strong. And it's quite common, to tell you the truth, in this market, that a lot of buyers are getting money from family. And I'll tell you, this happened to me not that many years ago, but I had a first-time buyer and competitive, and her dad, she had 2 sisters. Dad always gave the daughters 20% down payment to buy their first house. Always did it for her sisters. He was going to do it for her. So I said, okay, has he given it to you? No. I said, well, then we have to make your offer contingent. So no, I don't want to do that because I know that's one more contingency. I may not like that. So we went round and round, and I really told her, I said, and she said, it's my dad. You know, I'm willing to take that risk. So anyway, that's what we did. Went through the inspections, got the house appraised. Everything was moving along fine. Like the week before close, finally dad came into town drove by the house his little girl was gonna buy and says, I'm not giving you money for that dump. You know, didn't have a good idea of what you get for 100 grand these days, and would not give his daughter the money. And so my client lost the earnest deposit that she had. So you need to make sure that when they have that cash, that when they say they have that down payment, they really have it. Okay.
I have a quick question regarding that. So if you declare on the purchase agreement, just for example, that you are putting 20% down, and then after the deal's been accepted, then you kind of change it with your lender. So just say he suggested you put 15% down or something. So then would that be an addendum thing or?
Yeah. Well, yeah. But here's the thing. Let's just say they get the offer accepted with 20% down, and now they find out that they want to only put 15% down. They might not be able to do that because the seller might say, well, no, why is your offer not as good as it was a little while ago? Now, if it was, hey, the house needed a bunch of repairs and I want to save some of my cash to do those, maybe a seller will say, okay, that makes sense. But yes, anything that you do to change that should be in writing so that everybody's on the same page.
Okay, thanks.
Then in that paragraph, we'll say at an interest rate not to exceed. That is just a protection for your buyer. So whatever the going rates are, like if the going rates were 2 3/4 or something, I'd put on there like 3 or 3.5, just something, just, I guess the protection idea is in case all hell broke loose and the rates all of a sudden jumped up to 7%, then the buyer wouldn't have to go through with it. But that's just a rate a little bit better than the going rate is what I would use there. The last part of that, where you see all those check boxes where it says either the seller or the buyer agrees to pay an amount not to exceed so many dollars, representing repairs required as a condition of financing. And you should make a little note or underline that as a condition of financing, because that's different than the home inspection paragraph that we'll come to in a minute. What that is about is when you have an appraisal done, almost always the appraisal just simply determines the value of the house. But it's more common, like with an FHA deal, that if FHA sees something they don't like, they could reference it in the appraisal. And FHA is notorious for things like the stairs to the basement does not have a handrail, or the paint on the house and the windows is peeling. So you got to, scrape and paint it. Anything that's referenced on an appraisal becomes a condition of the loan. So just, so just know that. When it's on there, it must be taken care of. So this paragraph is where some people think they're being proactive to say, well, let's put on here that if something comes up on the appraisal and now it has to be fixed, let's just say that the seller will agree to pay up to $1,000. And they'll say, it's nice to get that negotiation out of the way, because if it's a problem, then I don't have to negotiate it later. And, maybe it's not a bad mindset, but I never do this. And I don't do it for a couple reasons. Number one, let's just say we wrote that in where the seller agrees to pay $1,000 and they agree, and we move forward. The appraisal comes in, does not require any repairs. So everything's good. We get to the closing. Obviously the seller then does not have to pay $1,000 for the repairs, right? So if they don't have to pay $1,000 for the repairs that they agreed to pay for, meaning they were prepared to pay it, that means the seller just benefited $1,000 and your buyer just got screwed for $1,000 because he just paid $1,000 more for the house than he should have. You follow me on that mindset? And so in my opinion, the easiest negotiation there is if the lender comes back and says, hey, we can't give a loan unless this repair gets done. I think that's an easy thing to negotiate, because that's not just like a buyer wish, it's a requirement of getting the financing. So I typically just put a 0 in there, and I really don't do that. I don't like it. If you don't mind, I'm going to back up. on the seller concession on number 7, where I talked about the, I used an example of like, the buyer says to the seller, I want you to pay 5,000 my closing cost. That's done all the time. Here's the tricky part of it. Number 1, you have to know how much is the closing cost. And so you typically call your buyer's lender and the lender says, yeah, just build in 5,000, that should be enough. So you write in the offer where the seller's going to pay 5,000. They agree. So everything's good. You're getting ready to close. And at the closing, you find out that the buyer's closing costs really were only 3,500. So the buyer isn't realizing that, because they're good. The seller's going to pay their closing cost. Everything's good. But the fact is, the seller was prepared to pay 5,000. Now they only had to pay 3,500. That means your buyer got screwed again for $1,500. So when you contact the lender, don't settle with a ballpark. Yeah, build in 5,000. That should be enough. Go, I need to know. I need to know, because it's just, in my opinion, it's like shame on you if you build in 5,000 for your buyer, get the seller to agree to it, but the seller doesn't need to pay that, most of it. You just kind of screwed the buyer. Okay?
Is there a clause that you can add to it that would cover that?
No.
No.
Because what happens is that in the mortgage world, the seller is only legally allowed to pay certain expenses. And so, like, you would like to think, well, if there's only 3,500, well, that's fine. Then just have the seller give them 1,500 difference. You can't do that. You can't have anything outside of the closing. So what I do is, when I'm writing an offer, or no, I'm going to, I contact my lender and I'll tell them, okay, if you notice, back to the listing card, I figured out how much the summer taxes were, the winter taxes were. And I tell my lender, here, we're doing this deal. This is when we're going to close. Here's the taxes. What's the expenses going to be? Then he'll tell me it's going to be 3,500. I go, okay, good. Now I have a number that I'm not going to complain if it's off a couple $100, but $1,000, that's a problem. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Let's fly on to page 2. Okay. The very top of page 2 is a continuation of the mortgage paragraph. And whether you do it here or there's another spot in this purchase agreement, but somewhere in your purchase agreement, you need to write in about the strength of your buyer. Who are they pre-approved with? Now, I'm a big Treadstone mortgage guy, because their pre-approvals come back and I can say the buyer is pre-approved with all verifications completed. My buyer wanted to use this company that's called Mr. Cooper. Has anybody ever heard of a Mr. Cooper loan? Me either. So I tried to talk my buyer into not using them, but he's used them several times. And it's a huge conglomerate, like one of the largest non-bank lenders in the country, billions of dollars in assets. But I never heard of them. So I need to build it up. So I just put buyer's pre-approval letter attached, and that the buyers used this company several times smoothly over recent years. So I'm trying to make my point. Don't be afraid, of a lender with a weird name of Mr. Cooper. Oh, good. That's not me, is it? That's what mine always does. Okay. The next box it references seller financing. Seller financing. The first one, it says contract. And when it says that, what it really is saying, land contract. And most of you might recognize that term of a land contract. We rarely use land contracts anymore, only because interest rates are so darn good. But a land contract is a method to transfer ownership where the seller becomes the bank. And it's very popular in vacant land. It's very popular with buyers that have issues, credit issues, low income. It's higher risk for a seller. But at the end of the day, it's where I could say to you, here, I'm going to buy your house on a land contract. I'm going to give you so much for a down payment. I'm going to make you payments at this interest rate for so long before I pay it off. And it's legal and I own the house, but you as the seller do not give me the deed to the property. It's still in your name. And that's how you were protected. That's another one that we can have a whole class on. So there are times when it really works out well. And if you run into that scenario, just give me a call. The other one is called a purchase money mortgage, which in concept is almost the same. It's the same, but yet different, but it is 100% the same as for the buyer is going to a bank. When a buyer gets a loan, they put down a down payment, the bank gives them a loan and they pay it back. They own the house, but there's a lien against the house in the amount of the mortgage. And that lien stays there until your buyer pays off that mortgage. The same thing happens with the purchase money mortgage, with the difference is that the seller is the bank. The seller gives the buyer the deed to the property, but they secure themselves in a first lien position exactly like a bank does. So you can see where there would be times when a seller may like it. The seller might say, hey, I love the idea of having an investment, getting whatever interest rate you can negotiate. And again, it doesn't happen much because most people want to get their money, but sometimes sellers don't care and it works out. The next box that says equity, you'll probably never use that, but that's where somebody wants to give the seller all the equity in their house and take over their mortgage. I guess the benefit in that is it must be like a really good interest rate for a buyer to want to take over the seller's mortgage, but it's just really not done much anymore. Number 9, contingencies. This is a big paragraph. The very first box, it says that this offer is not contingent on the need to sell any other property. And this is huge because most buyers need to sell, or if they don't need to sell, they need to at least close on their underlying house. Maybe they've accepted an offer on their house, but they're waiting for it to close. When this says not contingent, that means that they don't have any other property that they have to transfer in order to buy the house. So that shows good strength, but you need to make sure that that's the case. The second box says contingent upon closing. So that's where, like I said, the buyer accepted an offer to sell their house a couple weeks ago. Their house is sold and it's going to close in a couple weeks. So that just spells out that that has to happen, because if that doesn't happen and the buyer doesn't close and get their money, then they can't buy this house. Okay. The last box is what most of us consider the pure contingent offer, which means I want to buy your house. Here's the terms and conditions, but I really can't do anything until I get an offer on my house and sell it. Typically, when they do this, their house isn't even on the market yet. So you can say, well, why would I want to waste my time making an offer on a house when I can't do anything until I sell my house? Now, if you're a seller, you'd go, well, why not accept that? Because when you accept it, that paragraph also spells out really clear that the seller can keep their house on the market and they can sell it to whoever else they want. So for the buyer could get pinched out quickly. So for a seller, it doesn't hurt them. They can keep it on the market. A buyer would typically do that when they just fall in love with the house and they really are trying to do what they can to secure that house, but now they got to get their house on the market and try to market it and sell it. Okay. That will have more discussion. And that's a good one. I can give you a couple examples how I use that paragraph and where I would say, I want the seller. Well, I actually did this with my son. My son had a home in Elger, super hot market. They weren't ready to sell it because they didn't know what they wanted to buy yet. So we got the house ready to list. I had the photos taken and everything. So all they had to do is push a button. Now we're out looking at houses. Found a house they wanted to buy. We made the offer and we said to the seller, we want you to take your house off the market for 3 days to give us time to sell our house. And just sold them on the fact that their house is hot. They agreed. I listed it a minute later, had 25 showings in a day and 10 offers in a day. And so sometimes you can get a little creative and do that. And again, you have to see me if you're going to try that. Okay, so those are the contingent boxes. Paragraph 10, this is one of those paragraphs that you need to read over and over. And you really need to go over stuff because it gets into things that you normally don't think of, like, like invisible dog fencing, and it goes in, does it include the collar and the mechanism? It covers all that. But here's the key thing. It in general, it says things that are permanently attached to the house are going to remain. And then in addition, on the bottom, you can see that I wrote in that the stove, refrigerator, microwave, dishwasher, washer, dryer, and all window coverings, those are also included. I don't care that they may have spelled those out in the listing card because this is the agreement that matters, the agreement between a buyer and a seller. So that's why I wrote those all in. Other things that you might write in are things like the kids' play set in the backyard. You may or may not want it. So if you want it, you better spell it out that you do want it. If you don't want it, then in the next little paragraph, and you want to make sure that they take it out of there, then you better write in, that's not included. So the seller has to take that. And since some of these things are kind of important and they're easily missed because there's so much verbiage in a purchase agreement, I put little boxes in, as you can see, and made the buyer initial because it makes it stand out so there's no question about things. The part on here about all window coverings, pay attention to this because it can be a little tricky. The small print says that all curtain hardware stays. That means, the brackets, but it doesn't say that the actual curtains have to stay. And way back, my first deal I ever did, I wrote an offer, sold a house similar to this, and my buyer moved in, and he calls me up and goes, "Ed, the frickin' sellers took the curtains," because I wrote in the curtains remained. So I called the agent and said, "Hey, the seller took the darn curtains." So he calls the seller, and the seller said, "I didn't take any curtains. I didn't have curtains. I had drapes." And I'm going, and I tell you what, that was 40 years ago, telling you the truth. Today, I still don't know the difference between a curtain and a drape. So the one thing I've learned is that I want everything that's attached to a window treatment or a window covering, because that includes a valance, a shade, whatever. So use a generic term, but spell out all window coverings, all window treatments remain, okay? And then a lot of times on a listing, it will spell out what things are reserved. And if so, you just put it right in there where it says, but does not include. On the bottom of every page, you again put in the property address and the date and time that you were writing your offer. And again, that's what ties in all the pages together. Okay? So far, so good. Let's go to page 3. Number 11, heating and cooking fuels. And I tell you what, I'm not going to take the time to, obviously, to read all these paragraphs. You need to, and what you should do if you have never written a purchase agreement before, you should take a purchase agreement and write it up as if you were buying your house, just so you could get a feel for everything you need to do. And if you do that and then send it to me and say, this is a sample, I'll critique it for you. But you should do it because it's an eye opener. But when it comes to paragraph 11, heating and cooking fuels, that has to do with properties that have propane, fuel oil. Some these days even use just a pellet heating system. But on those type of systems, it basically says that at the time you transfer possession, the seller is going to assure that there's at least 10% in the tank. Okay. Now, this sounds like not a big deal, but you can be a hero to your client by understanding how this works. And for the most part, let's just talk about propane. Those are the big white tanks you see usually out in the country. We call them a pig or a big tank. Actually, just this past summer, I had a good friend and I talked to him about this. And he says, yeah. So he's coming to the closing. We get there, he's got a big grin on his face and he's shaking his head. And I go, what'd you do? He says, remember that propane thing you talked to me about? I just stopped at the house, it was a cottage, to get the last box. And there was the bill on the door that the company just came and filled his tank for $2,300 the day before the closing. And when that happens, LP tanks companies, they don't go back and pump it back out. You're just screwed. So he basically bought a full tank of LP for the buyer, and he shouldn't have. He should have contacted the LP company and go, hey, I'm going to be selling my house, so don't do your automatic fills anymore. I'll order as I go or something like that. Just be aware of what could happen, okay? Because if you think about it, if you say nothing and that happens, your client is not going to be happy with you because he would expect that you would know about those things, okay? Number 12, assessments. As a default, when you're representing a buyer, I would just always check that first box because it says that the seller is responsible to pay the balance of any assessments that are due or payable. Sometimes it's hard to know. If somebody checks that second box, then that means that they're aware of something. And then it's something like this. Maybe the gas, they just ran natural gas down the street or to the house. And let's say there's a $10,000 assessment for that, but the gas company said, here, you can just pay $100 a year, something like that, so that it's affordable. Well, it's possible if that's known, a buyer could say, well, I'll tell you what, I agree to accept those assessments of $100 a year. And then that way the seller doesn't have to pay the whole thing off at once. Doesn't happen often, but representative buyer, check the first box. Property taxes, this is positively another class. The first one, when it says no proration, this is really, in my opinion, probably the easiest initially to talk about because it just, you fill in the box and it tells you. If I check the first one that says, okay, it's saying who's going to pay the summer tax bill, the buyer or the seller, and which tax bill are we talking about? So that's real easy. But I'm going to tell you this, the most common is the calendar year tax proration, the second box. That is most commonly used around the country. I would say 99% of all of our transactions use calendar year tax proration. The reason it's used is because I think it's easy to explain. It's easy, but yet difficult. The easy part is if you read what calendar year tax proration says, it says first off, you take the taxes in the year of the closing. So let's say we're going to close something this year, it's 2021. It says, take whatever taxes are due. And right now, let's just say there's no taxes due because there's 2 taxes a year. A summer tax bill comes out July 1st. A winter tax bill comes out December 1st. Let's not get caught up in the due date, like the date you can pay without penalty. The taxes become a lien on the property July and December. So those are the taxes we're talking about for anything that's closed this year. So since those taxes aren't here yet, we can calculate what they are based on last year's and say, okay, the summer tax bill is going to be this much. The winter tax bill is going to be this much. That equals X amount of dollars for the year. We divide that by how many days in the year to get a daily amount of taxes. and we charge the seller from January 1 to the day we close. Pretty simple to explain. That's why we use it. But if I could, like, if you could see me grabbing onto you and like having you stare at me when I tell you, don't ever tell anybody it's fair, because it's not fair. It's just by far the most common and the way we do it. And if you really want me to confuse you, which I'm sorry, but it's just a confusing topic and this will confuse you, but this is why it's not fair. If we were going to close one, sell it today and close it in March, basically that means that we're going to figure out how much taxes are for 2021, and we're going to charge the seller from January 1, let's say through the end of March. So they're going to pay a quarter of the year's taxes at closing. You follow me on that? Do you guys? That's calendar year tax proration. So just picture that. We're going to close the end of March. The seller is going to pay roughly a quarter of the year's taxes. The reason it's not fair is, let's forget that for a minute and just simply say, when's the last time a summer tax bill was paid? Tell me, guys, when was a summer tax bill last paid? Well, taxes come out in July. So it must have been July of 2020, the summer taxes were paid, and they paid from July of 2020 until July 1st of 2021, paid in advance. So what about that money that they paid in advance? Not only did they pay it in advance till July, but they're paying again from January through March, based on our calendar year proration. To make it more significant to you, when's the last time a winter tax bill was paid? It was for December of 2020, which covered the time period to December of 21. So we paid in advance for winter taxes all through next year. And on top of that, because we're not getting any of that back, the seller's also paying again from January to the closing in March. I know it's complicated, but hopefully it's enough that you go, hey, that's not right. And it's not. And if your sellers figure it out, you just say, you know what, it's not right. But it's complicated. People don't understand it. 99% are paid through calendar year tax proration. And you know what? We're going to screw the seller when you go buy something. You know, it's that type of thing. Okay, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm looking at a little comment here. Lance, is 2.5 acres the standard without water and sewer? No, the acreage really has nothing to do with water and sewer.
I'm talking about the lots, the lot size needed to install septic. Does that depend on the local government and what their zoning policies are?
With regards to installing water or sewer?
Well, let's say I've got a 10-acre parcel without water and sewer. How many lots can I subdivide out of a 10-acre parcel? Is that dependent on local zoning? Or is there used to be a standard once upon a time, about 2.5 acres?
Okay, I'm a little confused, but typically you can always split 10-acre parcels into 2.5 acre pieces. But the problem, the reason you got to be careful is that it all depends how the parent parcel was split. You might have to wait a couple years before you get all those splits. When it comes, you know, that's why it's complicated. You need to go to the township and generically, you know, that if you have, you know, so many acres that you can split it so many ways based on general municipality guidelines. But those guidelines will say, okay, you have to have a minimum of 2 acres, but you also have to have a minimum of 200 foot of road frontage. So you may not have enough because your frontage might be too narrow.
Understood.
Yeah, and with water and sewer, it really just depends where it is, where it's run. Now, taxes are always paid in advance, correct? Okay. Good question. I believe that is true. We have a lender partner with our office that doesn't agree with that, but I think I can argue it and prove it every time. So I think that you should always assume that taxes are always paid in advance. I mean, think about it. What municipality has enough money to basically go the whole year and use their own money and they get reimbursed when they get taxes? They're begging to get their taxes. That's why they've changed it to where the summer tax is the big one now, because they get more of their money sooner because they need it. So, yeah. Okay. Let me see. Where am I at here? Oh yeah, I'm still property taxes. So we use calendar year tax proration simply because it's the most common. The last one there is fiscal year proration. In that one, this is just wonderful because I tell you, what to do. I'll tell you that this is the fiscal year in advance is the fair way to do it, but nobody cares about fair because they really don't understand it, and people will disagree. Fiscal year in advance would be like if we're going to close in March, and if we said, well, the last summer tax bill that was paid was July, and it paid through July of 21, then a buyer closing in March should reimburse the seller for March, April, May, and June. They should give that money back to the seller. That's right. That makes sense. It's fair. But it's too complicated. And even though you will believe it, you not only have to get the other agent to understand it, and they don't understand it. So this is one that you'll just have to learn what way you want to do it. But I'm just telling you, calendar year tax proration, 99% of the time, that's what we use. Okay. Well and septic. Okay. This is one of the biggest issues in our purchase agreement because everyone has a different opinion of things. The second paragraph there, put a little star there because it says, where no county or government protocols in place. Our agreement is saying that the seller will pay for a well and septic evaluation and they will pump the septic tank. There will be some of you who become an expert in septics that will say it's good to pump the septic every couple of years. Kent County Health Department says you should do it every 2-3 years. Others say you should never pump it. You should let it go through its natural thing. There are some municipalities that will say we do want to have the septics pumped or we do not want you to have them pumped. So this agreement is just saying, we're saying we don't know what the legal way is. We're just saying if everybody agrees to our purchase agreement, they're saying that the seller is going to pay for the well and septic inspection and pay for the pumping. So just make sure you read it and you understand that. Okay. And you guys, when you see one of these things and you go, man, he flew right through that. I want more. Another time, just shoot me a message. You go, I really would love to get into this debate. And then what I can have Chanel do is say, hey, a couple of you wanted, because I tell you, if one of you have a question about whatever, the others probably would have interest. And I'll do another class on that topic. So don't hesitate if there's something I can do to help later.
But I do have a quick question about the well and septic. Would that information be on their website typically, like easy to find out if they are not wanting it pumped, or is that?
You would like to think so. I think that see what's weird about this. When the septic is evaluated, the sanitary or the person who's doing that inspection, in my opinion, relies on a pump card. And that's when the septic company goes out and pumps the septic. They typically do a diagram and they make comments, about if it was sludgy or if it was this or it was that. And without doing a pump, how would they know? So I think it's healthy if I'm a buyer, I want to know all I can. So I'm going to want the seller to pay for that septic pumping. But yeah, as soon as you get out of the county and you get out of other areas, it's good to check with those municipalities and find out if they have certain rules. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you remember this, but I don't know if it was 10 years ago or so, but for a long time, the city of Grand Rapids had the city sidewalk point of sale evaluation, which meant we could not, basically every property we sold in the city of Grand Rapids, the city had to go out and certify that the sidewalk and the driveway approach through to the street was in good condition. And you had to get an approval. And if it wasn't good, like if a tree trunk, heaved the sidewalk so it was cracked or lifted, which most of them were, then you had to get it fixed, or the city gave you a quote and it would say, yeah, we'll come out and replace that for $700. And so then on the closing, we had to negotiate and the seller had to pay for that. And their mindset was, well, at some point in time, all the sidewalks and driveways at the road will all be in good shape. Well, they finally did away with it, but everybody has a different thing they want. I've been on the regional forms committee for years and years, and this is the one that we just struggle with the most because different municipalities, and I'm on, this committee has realtors through 8 different MLSs and associations. And so they all have a little different thing. So together we came up with this paragraph that we think is the best for wellness septics. Okay.
Again, my conservation hat for a moment. Those ordinances continue to change because you remember Berry County had a very stringent inspection policy of septic tanks that existed up until 4 years ago.
Right.
Keep in mind too that over 25% of the septic systems in existence have failed. That's a hard number.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And it's, you know what, when there's a problem, it's a problem. And I tell you what, because people, sellers don't want to pump the tanks because that's normally, it's $400 or sometimes more. It's just a tough pill. There's different things that can affect, how they work. So yeah, you got to get them inspected, do the best you can, help your buyer get educated, do your due diligence. Okay, paragraph 15, the inspections, investigations. This is a huge, huge thing because if a deal falls apart, almost always it's due to the buyer's home inspection. Now, the paragraph in itself says that within 10 days after the effective date, so in other words, if we wrote our offer today, that day one would be tomorrow, the buyer pays to have the house inspected as much as they want. Buyers typically will have radon test, heating, electric structure, plumbing. And the next paragraph with it is investigations. And we always focus on inspections, but the investigations are just as important because when you have that buyer that decides they want to put up a pole barn, you need to make sure that you send them to the township and find out exactly what the rules are, what size, what requirements, what's the setbacks, all those good things. They're important. I also had one where, I sold one of those, 100 and some year old farmhouses on Belding Road on some acreage. And the buyer wanted to do one of those roadside vegetable stands, but you need to get a permit from the township to do those. So you know what? I'm not going to tell you you can or you can't. Buyer, you get your tail down to the township and find out if you can do it. So the inspections, you guys, we're in a really different world with real estate over the last couple of years. This inspection paragraph, the purpose of it is to make sure a buyer knows what they're getting into. It used to be, it made it a wish list for a buyer. They'd have an inspection, then they'd come back to the seller and hammer the seller to say, I want you to install a GFI outlet in the kitchen, and I want this and this and this and this. And when there were harder to sell homes, sellers had to get more agreeable and do those things. Today, sellers are going, we're not doing anything. So you got to be really careful, but the purpose of it is still the same. It's for the buyer to have the opportunity to know what they're getting into. Once you have the inspection, the first question to your buyer is there anything that's scaring you away that you want to terminate the deal? Hopefully not. there are options. The buyer can just terminate, end of story. The buyer can say, okay, at least I know what I'm up against and I'm okay with it. Then you move forward. Or the buyer can go back to the seller and say, hey, I want this, this, and this. I want the price reduced by this, and I'll take care of everything that the inspection needs, which is fine. If the buyer gives the seller a proposal, a written proposal, the seller can say, okay, I agree. They can say, you know what, I agree to part of this, but I will renegotiate and propose this. But here's the big one. The seller can also instantly terminate. And that is like an eye opener. That's one of those things that you go, what the, are you kidding me? So when you have, because today the odds are if your buyer wins and is getting the house, they beat out many other offers because most homes have multiple offers. So when the buyer goes back and opens up the contract and try to negotiate, the seller can instantly terminate and take a backup offer. So it's really hard. And you have to have that hard discussion with your buyer. And here's the trick. And matter of fact, it's funny. I like doing examples where I'm really familiar because on this listing and this purchase agreement, I just did it this past week. So we did the inspection and it came back with a bunch of stuff. And a lot of it was a brick house. So it had a lot of brickwork. So rather than do an addendum, because there was bunches of offers, I went to the agent and I go, here's the home inspection. And there is a ton of stuff. None of it is scaring the buyer away, but I just want to make sure that you know that they're willing to take on all these different things. But here's the issue. The brickwork is a huge problem and it's going to cost the bid. For the home inspection, I had the buyer bring a brick mason to get a quote. And this was like, in rough numbers, $6,000 to fix this brickwork. And we had a plan. And my buyer and I, we had a discussion with that. If we could get that seller to come close to splitting the cost of that repair, that would be awesome. But we didn't want to lose the house if they said no. So I had to talk with the other agent. So I didn't open up the contract, but like, could you talk to your seller? Is there something that you think we can do to find some middle ground? And so he looked it over. He says, well, I think maybe I can get the seller to agree to pay $2,500. And so I get back and I say, you know what? If we can get your seller to go $2,500, I know I can the buyer will agree to that. So we had communication, we had dialogue, verbally got it worked out, and then we put it in writing. Because if I would have just did the addendum and asked for something, the odds are the seller would have just terminated it and gone to the next offer. So, and the other thing that people are doing is just because this agreement says 10 days, doesn't mean that you have to wait all of 10 days. You can shorten that period and do it much shorter. Some buyer agents and buyers are willing to waive the inspections. But I'm telling you, it is such a scary thing for me to have you have a client that buys a house with not having inspections at all. It's just scary. And sellers love it because it doesn't give them an opportunity to find anything, known or unknown. So at any rate, that's inspections. And also it goes through the time frame. And normally with inspections, it's 3-day time periods. You know, here the buyer makes this proposal, the seller has 3 days to do this. Kind of interesting. Okay. I'm going to jump to number 17. Is just the paragraph about title insurance. And in the old days, sellers typically paid for title insurance, and then the buyer and seller closed at the same title company, and everybody closed together, and that's the way we did it. But then years ago, all different companies started their affiliations with their own title company. And at Keller Williams, we have our own title company too. We have a relationship with TransNation. So we want all of our deals to close through Trans. they look out for us. They give us all kinds of benefits, and it helps us in our profit line for our office, blah, blah, blah. And so it's very commonplace that you have what we call split closings. And that's because this purchase agreement, you'll see where it says the seller agrees to pay for an owner's policy of title insurance in the amount of the sale price. So the seller does, he pays for it. But when the buyer is getting a mortgage, the buyer has to pay for a mortgage policy of title insurance and also pay for their side of the closing. So what typically happens, the seller closes at his title company, the buyer closes at our company, the title companies work out all the details, and that's how we do it. To make it easy, or just make sure everybody's aware, in the last line of paragraph 17, I just wrote in like an FYI that the buyer's title work and closing is going to be through TransNation Title, and which one I use. It's not really a negotiation of any sort. It's simply just an FYI, so that their title company knows that there's going to be a split closing. Okay, number 18, property survey. This is positively a topic that we should have our discussion on. I think that you are very foolish if you allow your buyer to close on a transaction without getting a survey. Now, I have softened some to go, I think it's crazy to not have a survey at all. I guess it's okay if the seller has a survey, provided it shows the improvements. It's easy to know what the improvements are. Does the house have a garage? Does it have a fence? Does it have a shed? Do all of those things show up on a survey? If it does, and those things are within the lot lines, I think you're good. In this sample, they did have a existing survey, so I spelled it out that way. But if not, again, I can tell you so many horror stories, and you need to understand that my role and my position, I find out all the things that have gone wrong. I had one not long ago where a buyer had an investor that bought a HUD home. That's just basically a bank foreclosed home. And it was a property in the city of Grand Rapids, been around for, it's an 80-year-old home or whatever. And there's the house, had a little walkway that went over to the garage. And it's typical in the city to have a parcel that would be like lots 1, 2, 3, 4 of Riverside Gardens. And it's several lots, and there's the house and garage. Agent says to his investor buddy, well, you want a survey? And they go, well, the seller won't pay for one. He said, no, sellers never want to pay for one, but you should probably buy one just to make sure. He says, I'm not worried about it. Look at it. The house and garage has been there for 80 years. No survey done. Buyer buys the house, goes to the house. Everything's fine at the house. Walks over to the garage, and the keys don't open the garage. So he breaks into the garage, gets the door open, and goes, holy cow, I just hit the mother lode. There's a boat, there's snow blowers, there's tools, there's just full of good stuff. And sure enough, the neighbor on the other side comes over and about ready to shoot him for breaking into his garage. He says, what do you mean your garage? I just bought this house. The guy says, well, you maybe bought the house, but you sure as hell didn't buy this garage. And here's an interesting thing, and I hope I don't lose you on this. When the seller lost the house and it was foreclosed on, again, it was the house in the legal description was lots 1, 2, 3, 4. And that included the house and the garage. So the bank foreclosed on the guy. And once they foreclosed and they boot him out, they basically pay off the mortgage. They own the property. And now they go to resell the property, okay? When they did all this and they foreclosed, their legal department screwed up and they foreclosed on lots 1, 2, 3 and forgot to add lot 4, which was the garage. So when they foreclosed and paid off the mortgage that had a lien on lots 1, 2, 3, 4, it cleared the lien against the garage, took the house, but it left the seller who lost the house with a garage on lot 4 that had no lien on it. So he sold it to the neighbor. So, but as you can imagine, the new buyer was now pissed and sued his buddy realtor because he didn't push hard enough to get a survey, and he didn't get a survey. I mean, there's stories galore. I mean, but it's really important. You need to know, and if you have a client that wants to put up a fence or put up a shed, then get a new survey. You need to know where the corners are. Okay. Number 19 is home protection plan. That basically is just saying, letting you know that a home warranty program is a product that you can buy. And buyer can pay for it, seller can, you can negotiate to have a seller pay for it. You know, it's roughly $400 to $500. And what it does, it gives the buyer 1 year coverage on just about anything that breaks. That's like a generic thing. But it is such common, it's, you know, around the country that they've incorporated the be aware that they are available right in the purchase agreement. So just because it's there doesn't mean that you have to negotiate for it. In this case, I just put, you know, exceptions to it, go none. Yeah, we know, but we're not going to negotiate for one here. And the other thing through these purchase agreements, every single paragraph, try to end it with either putting in none or NA if it's not applicable. It gets you into a habit of covering every paragraph, okay? All right. Number 20 is just the small print that says prorations, you know, rent, association fees, any of those things always get prorated to the day of close. Not a big deal. Paragraph 21, closing. Now this is interesting because especially for you new guys, you think, well, how do I, you can tell me when you want to close, but how do you know the lender can be ready? So you need to work with your buyer's lender and know upfront, how much time do they need? You know, is 30 days enough? Do they need more? If you notice that we wrote this offer on January 31st, and we put that we're going to close on March 5th. So that's roughly just over a month. That should be good. I mean, I just say that so that you're not putting unrealistic dates down, or you're not putting the date so far out that it might not be a good thing for the seller. So put close by March 5th. Paragraph 22 has to do with possession. So we put that possession will be given at 5:00 p.m. on the 21st day after the completion of the closing of the sale. So again, that really helps you fine tune so you'll have zero issues with when is possession. So whatever, if we close on March 5th, regardless of what time, day one starts on the next day. And at 5 p.m. on the 21st day, that's when my buyer gets possession. And so my buyer offered for the seller that they can stay there in his house for 21 days for free, no charge. And again, this is the interesting thing. You know, in a perfect world, representing a buyer, you never want a seller to stay in the buyer's house. It should be you close, buyer gives them his money, you should get the keys, and the buyer should be able to move in. But in the world where the sellers are in charge, because there's so many buyers to every listing, sellers are able to get free possession almost always. So whatever it is, it is. You know, you negotiate it whatever way you want. If you look farther in that paragraph, in this case, it says, okay, the seller is going to be out on the 21st day after close, but if they don't, then it shows as liquidated damages, then the seller has to pay $125 a day. And, you know, I'm always, I tend to want to put a huge number there, $500, $1,000 a day, because if you think about it, you know, buyer is taking time off work, arranging the movers, arranging friends, family, they all show up and the seller's not out. I mean, that's a big deal, but you need to have something in there and it has to be a reasonable amount.
Ed, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So that sentence with on the 21st day, that's subjective based on where the market's at. We're in a seller's market now.
Yeah.
If it, it's an ebb and flow, it goes to a buyer's market somewhere down the road, that may go to zero.
Absolutely. And I tell you, for most of my career, it was zero. Is possession at close, or a week, or 3 or 5 days, or something like that. Oh, see? So much for my phone ringing when it's on. Sorry. Okay, I have my Bluetooth off and it's still ringing. Okay, sorry. Yeah, you're right. It really depends on how the market flows. Because when you think about it, here's the buyer getting a mortgage, paying for a mortgage, and the seller staying in his house in the 21 days I put in here. Trust me, that's unusual. Mostly it's 30 days. Sellers are getting 30 days for free almost always. So there's ways you sell it to a buyer. You just have to explain the market. This is what they want. And the beauty for a buyer is that if they were closing, like my buyer on this was going to close on March 5th. His first house payment isn't going to be due until May 1st. So it's kind of painless because the seller gets to stay there from March 5th to April 5th. And then buyer gets to take possession. First payment isn't until May 1st. So it makes it not so painful, but you are right. When the market changes, I've always personally hated having my seller be out of the house so that they can give possession to a buyer the day of the closing. Think of the risk for a seller to do that. I mean, they move their family. First off, how do they move into a house before they get their money to go buy another one? So what I tried to do is, even in a different market, is to have a seller have like 1 week to get out. That seemed to close and then make your move. And then if something happened and the buyer got hit by a car on the way to closing, at least you haven't physically moved your family out of a house. But it all depends on the market conditions at the time. So yeah, you're 100% right. But right now, sellers get their possession if they need it. Okay, let's fly to paragraph. Oh, I'm at the last part. It's back the next page 5, but on the end of paragraph 22, it talks about what's the security that the seller has that the buyer, or what securities the buyer had that the seller's going to leave the house decent. The end of that paragraph, it basically says that what the seller obligation is. They're obligated to leave the house free from debris and clutter, broom clean condition, which doesn't mean it has to be great. So some sellers do a great job and they really clean things, so it's nice. Others don't, but the buyer has to understand that they're obligated to leave it in broom clean condition. So when you need to use your common sense. So when you're selling this is common when you have some acreage and the seller has like a junkyard out in the back. There's washers and dryers in this big hole full of junk and trash. That's not going to get out of there. So then you should spell out that all the debris, all the garbage must be removed. And you might need to have some negotiating on that. But if it's been sitting there for years, the odds are it's going to stay there. So either your buyer better wrap around and understand it's going to be there, or you spell out that it's got to get removed. Now, the next paragraph talks about, when the offer is going to be presented. So on this, I wrote in there that the buyer was giving the seller until 8 p.m. on February 1st to respond to this offer. Now, it's nice for you to just say that's what I want, but if you're smart, you'll check with the listing agent and say, okay, if I give you an offer on the evening of January 31st, when will you be able to present it? And based on that response, then you put that in here. Today, it's pretty common that in a listing contract, the seller spells right out in the listing contract that all offers are going to be presented on this time, in this time frame. So you'll know. But if not, just ask the agent. If you If it doesn't make any reference about, you know, a set time, then typically give them 24 hours. Write it in there. In this, then the next part is where we agree to place an earnest deposit. And what I said is that we'll do a $3,000 earnest deposit shall be submitted to Keller Williams within 24 hours of acceptance. Now think of this. This earnest money is a big deal, okay? I mean, you must have it timely. And if you just wrote, like most agents, just wrote 3,000 to Keller Williams, and you were sending your offer to be signed electronically, like most do, how do you have the earnest money? You don't. So you need to spell out, if your buyer is local and you know you can get it within a day, then you do what I did and say, we'll get it within 24 hours of acceptance. If your buyer is in Chicago and you know darn well that your buyer is going to sign this offer out of state, well, then you should say, okay, the buyer will place a $3,000 deposit in the mail to Keller Williams within 24 hours of acceptance. And that buys you some mail time. But if don't just say that you're getting this deposit upon acceptance, unless you are going to physically be with the buyer when he signs, and then you collect the deposit. Follow me on that? So just spell out what it's going to be so that you're protected. There's a lot of reading in that paragraph, but the purpose of earnest money, it's a good faith deposit. So in the course of an offer, there are several things that are contingent. The first thing that we found, if you recall, and what we've done so far, is that house has to appraise. You got to get through that part. You have to get through the home inspection part. And let's say you get in it, because if those didn't work and the home inspection wasn't acceptable to the buyer and you terminated, then the buyer gets his money back. But if we get past the appraisal part, we get past the inspections, and we get to the point where the lender is prepared to give the buyer a loan, but the buyer doesn't close, then the buyer's what we call in default. So if the buyer's in default, then that earnest money is going to be forfeited and given to the seller as damages. But when we have a discrepancy where the seller doesn't agree and the buyer wants his money back and doesn't think he's in default, and the seller thinks that's debatable and they want to fight about it, I'm not giving the money to anybody. And it's a complicated process, but it spells some of that process out. What I can do then is if there's a dispute, I can send out a disposition letter that would say, hey, everybody, hey, players, buyer, seller, I'm going to, because of this, I believe the buyer is entitled to their deposit, and I'm going to give it back to them within 15 days or within 30 days, pending any legal action from anybody else. But as soon as I get a statement from the other side going, we don't agree, we want that money, then I don't give it out to anybody. And then I'm forced to file an interpleader where I go and I start a lawsuit. And I go, hey, judge, I have this $3,000. We don't have an agreement on how it should be dispersed. The buyer wants it, seller wants it. So here, we'll start a lawsuit. You figure it out. And that's insane to do, because now I forced a lawsuit, which means both parties have to get legal representation. It's going to cost more to settle it. So we normally find ways to settle it. Now, I'm trying to hurry through to get to this other part here, but paragraph 24 is just, remember, you're a realtor. We sell real estate. Don't try to be, in trying to know everything and to be all things to all people. Don't get caught up with trying to be an attorney. Don't be afraid when you get questions that are asking you to get involved with something that's beyond your scope of professionalism. You're not a CPA, you're not an attorney. If the questions come up, go, I highly recommend that you consult your attorney. I highly recommend you consult your CPA. Okay, now keeping in mind this house, and if you remember, the listing price on this house was $249,900. I want to give you a little background. My buyer, this was the 8th house we tried to buy. 8 times we tried to buy a house and 8 times we lost. The last house we made an offer on, we offered an escalation clause up to 30,000 above, and we still lost. So here's a house listed at 249,900. If you recall, the offer I wrote was at full price. Now, in the other provisions on paragraph 26, now I'm trying to see what can I do to sweeten our deal. So I put the buyer's inspection period to be shortened from 10 days to 5 days. You know, that might help. Then I put C escalation clause addendum up to 300,000. I mean, think about that. That's 50,000 higher than asking price. That is insane. And I know it's insane. And I told my buyer, this is insane, but this is our 9th try. He wants to get a freaking house. And I also put in here that the buyer agrees to a $15,000 appraisal shortage guarantee. Now, these are all points that people are using all the time. The escalation clause basically says that, let me see, do I have it on here? Let me get, yeah, let's quick jump a couple pages to the escalation clause addendum. So what this addendum says is that, yeah, I made an offer of $249,900, but we will pay $3,000 above any and other bona fide offer up to $300,000. Now, there's all kinds of more detail in there to make sure that these other offers are, you know, real. They're not bogus. They're not built in paying closing costs or things, real offers. So that's the offer we made. How could you make an offer any stronger? You know, I mean, if you think about it, this guy wanted this house. I would have been so pissed if he had to pay $300,000 for this house because it's not worth it. But we could only give a $15,000 appraisal shortage guarantee. So in other words, you know, whatever the price is, if the appraisal was at least 15,000 less, the buyer would still move forward and close on it at that price. So we make this offer. Buyer signs it on paragraph 30. On paragraph 31, the seller responds to our offer and they spell out that the price is to be $264,000. So obviously we were kind of happy with that because it's a lot better than $300,000. And that was basically $3,000 above the other best offer, which happened to be $261,000. So that's why the escalation clause pushed our offer price then, and the seller accepted $264,000. That makes sense to you? Follow that? And also the seller made comment about reserving the lockers in the breezeway. So that was smart for them, so that if there was any, you know, thought like maybe we thought these lockers were attached to the breezeway or not, but they accepted this offer. They sent me a copy of their other offer, and my buyer was happy then that they were paying, that he was going to pay $264,000. So the seller makes that counter offer on number 31. On number 32, they spell out that there's been no change to the seller's disclosure statement that we had filled out. Seller signed making that counter offer on number 35. I take it to my buyer on paragraph 36. He signs agreeing to those changes. And you always have to have proof that everybody has seen the acknowledgement of the agreement. So the seller had to also sign again on number 37, acknowledging that they know the buyer accepted their counteroffer. Boom. That's the deal. It's accepted. That's the purchase agreement. Now, I know we spent like an hour and a half almost on the first page, I think, and then we kind of flew through the rest. But I know how these classes are and that they can be so boring for you, and I'm sorry, a lot of technical things, but you know, we kind of touched on everything. Now, the escalation clause is one that not everybody likes, okay? And I'll tell you, it's a joke within our office because for years, I would laugh at these people and say, if you wrote me an offer that had an escalation clause and I'm representing a seller, I would look at this offer and say, boy, you put in writing that your buyer would go up to 300,000. I might just come back to you and counter your offer and say, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to counter you and say, no escalation clause. The price is going to be 290. And in my mindset, I could say, well, you know what? That's 10 grand less than the max you were willing to go. So I'm just going to do that. And most buyers would say, okay, I'll agree to it. Now, this time it worked out well for the buyer because they actually used the escalation in the manner that we intended it to pay 3,000 over the next best deal. But not all agents will, some will say, don't give me an escalation. And so then that means that we just have to give it our best shot. Who knows what my buyer would have ended up doing if we just had to give it our best shot without an escalation. But I really like the purpose of the escalation in this case, and it worked out well, as you can see, I think. So anything jump out at you, or anything that surprises you, or anything that you wonder about? Gang?
I've got a question
Please.
on the professional advice section of it. It's probably unique to me, but I am a builder. Is there anything specific that I need to address to make sure that I'm clear which hat I'm wearing and people don't think I'm giving them more advice than I
Yeah.
would a real estate agent?
Yeah, you know what? That's it's a good question because it depends on how you wave that flag. If you represent a buyer who's buying an existing home, I guess the danger for you would be, will they interpret a lot of what you have to say as being an inspector, for example? And I can tell you this, I tell our agents, especially when I show a house, and I tell you what, I don't wear a double hat like you. Being a builder, you have more knowledge than I do with most things about a house. And so for me, when I'm showing a house, there's danger for me to say, man, the furnace looks good. What the hell does that mean? That means that they dusted it off. I don't have a clue if it's in good shape, but I can tell you it looks good because it's clean. But I can see where a buyer would interpret my comments about that maybe above my scope of professionalism. I think for you, because I would like to think that you will still promote the benefit of a home inspection, and you can use your knowledge to be helpful there. But I don't think I would ever suggest that you would use that in saying, okay, I don't think you need a home inspection because in my opinion, this is good. A home inspection, if you know, for you guys, if you've never gone through one, you should, I make a point, I don't go anymore because I have a hard time shutting my mouth, and anything that comes out of my mouth is not beneficial to me. And in reality, I'm just hearing myself talk because I don't know about the condition of everything. You know, I really just don't know. So I typically, sometimes I pop in at the end just to find out if there's anything that was scary. I think for you being a builder, I don't think there's anything, I think it's a good thing because I think it will just give you more credibility about a lot of things. And I think that whatever you say will be powerful, but yet in the same breath, you should always still say, but you should still have a home inspector.
Makes sense.
But it's easy to get caught up with stuff. You may know of, capital gains or some things, but you know what? When they ask you for the tax advice, even though you have the answer, I would still send them back to their own CPA, or I'd push based on their questions that they really need to get confirmation from a CPA type person. Let us do the negotiating and tell them what we think and how this should be done. But yeah, I think you'll be good though. It's a crazy business out there, but you know what? At the end of the day, people just want to feel that you care. That's the biggest thing. When you're out there competing, since a bunch of you are new, you need to use that as your advantage. I mean, if you're competing against me, for example, and you think, okay, I have 40 years experience, and I mean, I have some benefits. I mean, I know what they are and I sell my benefits, but I know that you should simply focus in on letting them know that you care about them. That's all they care about. They typically don't care about how many deals did you do last year. They just care that you're going to look out for their best interest. And if you get pushed in any way, you need to learn to use things to your benefit. Like some people might say, I'm an asset. So you might go, Ed Hansen's part of my team. He's our broker. And then you use me. If I can help you, you use me and I'll help you. But don't feel you can't compete with these people that are so into promoting themselves as being, we're all number one at some point. I was number one in the whole state on January 5th when I sold this one deal over this one period of time. But just care about people, do the right thing, let them know, and they'll take care of you for life if you stay in touch with them. I know there's a lot of stuff there, and you really you should focus in on writing an offer on a house just for practice. Scan it, email it to me. I mean, I'll look it over. We can discuss things. I tried to use this as example just so that you can see there's different ways, and it's sometimes easier to see it filled out than a blank purchase agreement. But don't hesitate to ask questions. Five to 12, not so bad. Any other questions for me, guys? Gals?
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck at your training. Those that are teaching, I think, are happy to pitch in and help. So don't hesitate to reach out and holler if anything I can do for you guys.
Thank you very much.
Chanel, you're back.
I am. I've been here the whole time.
Oh, have you really?
Of course I have. I wouldn't leave you.
I would have if I were you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning, and we will see you tomorrow at the sales meeting.
Sounds good. See y'all.